Welcome to the ZNL Podcast, a podcast brought to you by ZN, the OG digital agency in Brussels.
Hi, and welcome to this edition of ZNL. I am very, very happy today to have a special guest, a Brussels legend, somebody who's got extensive experience in the EU communication space. He's been working in different incarnations in communication, from founding an agency to creating and chairing Forum Europe, and also the founder of and editor of Encompass, and much, much more. Welcome, Paul. How are you today?
I'm fine, and it's a pleasure to be with you, Phil. Can I just point out before we start, the empty bookshelves at the back are looking sad because we're in the process of moving house, and I've literally given hundreds of books away. Okay, that's out of the way. I feel less vulnerable now. Thank you.
That's fantastic. In the spirit of authenticity, we have an actual real backdrop rather than a fake one. So I think that's fantastic. So I think a lot of people know about you in some of your different incarnations in Brussels. But I'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you to this city, and what was your kind of journey from, how did you get into communication, and how did you start your entrepreneurial journey?
Right. Well, I'm sure this is not particularly unique, but I studied French and politics at university, and then I went off and managed to get into the very first year of the European University Institute in Florence, which was quite a life-changing experience, not least because that's where I met my future wife, and amazingly, we're still together all those years later. I then went off to work for a member of the European Parliament in the first directly elected European Parliament back in '79, and then realized that based in London, but then realized that maybe Brussels was a place to go. And like a lot of young, terribly keen, slightly naive professionals, I wanted to work for the European project, work for the European Commission or the Parliament. And surprisingly, I couldn't get a job immediately. So one day I saw an article in a British newspaper called The Hidden Persuaders, all about UK lobbying. And I very naively wrote to two of the people practitioners quoted in that article, saying, please give me a job. And to cut a very long, boring story short, they both gave me a job, but they didn't give me a job with any kind of infrastructure. So that's how I became a consultant and a self-employed consultant, because I had to look after my own infrastructure.
So does that mean that when you started your company, you were kind of introducing lobbying or public relations to Brussels, or was it already established? How mature was the market you entered?
Well, it wasn't mature at all. It sounds strange even to me when I say it, but I can tell you the honest truth that when I arrived in Brussels, there was the European Business Group, then had a different name. Now it's called Business Europe. IBM had a presence because it was undergoing a quite important antitrust investigation by the European Commission. And there were no consultancies. There was one consultancy, an American one, Hill and Knowlton, but it had for a Benelux public relations practice. So if you can imagine a world in the bubble without consultancies, without trade associations, and without corporations, or very few, that's the world I entered back in 1981.
And can you tell me, why do you think that at that time public relations or public affairs was not perceived as a kind of necessity as it is today? So what really changed? Was it the structure of the institutions?
Well, I think it was just the stage of development of the European Union. Of course, it wasn't called that in those days, and we kind of forget now. But when there's something called the Single Act, not to be too nerdy, Phil, which introduced qualified majority voting in the Council, which introduced a second reading in the European Parliament. That only took effect in 1987. So for the first 30 years of the European Union's existence, obviously with a much smaller membership, 6, then 9, then 10, there was absolute majority, one reading in the Parliament, which meant two things. One is that things got stuck in the Council for a very, very, very long time without any kind of outcome. We kind of forget that now. When people hanker back to the so-called glory days, the golden days when the European Union was much smaller, more congenial, things weren't really happening, and maybe historians can confirm that. And the European Parliament got increasingly fed up. They would issue an opinion on something, and it would be sent to the council only for it to be lying there totally untouched and unread for a very long time. And then things, of course, changed dramatically in 87 with this single act process. And I asked myself how I managed to survive from 81 to 87 when this kind of paralysis was going on. I think I survived partially because I was literally the only kid in town, and people were kind of bemused by this guy walking around, terribly keen, terribly enthusiastic, trying to find out what was going on. And in a funny way, especially for the European Parliament, making them feel that they were being recognized, because there was somebody on the outside taking an interest in what they were doing.
So you basically started this, I guess, conversation about the importance of public affairs and PR. But you were also an entrepreneur, which, in Brussels is still quite exceptional. And a lot of people like, the big institutional frameworks or the corporate world. What made you choose to create your own company? And how did you feel about the risks? Since at the time, I don't think people were talking about entrepreneurship as a thing in the way people talk about it today.
Well, you're very kind and very generous, Phil. I'm not sure I saw myself in those days as an entrepreneur. I was, and to be very candid, I was a one-man band for a very long time. I didn't have offices across the world and hundreds of people working for me, not at all. And I was very happy in those days. I was much younger, obviously, and it was great. But then I became, I suppose, I was working for myself, maybe because maybe some people didn't want to give me a job, so I had no options but to become a self-employed operator. What changed was then it sounded a bit glib, but there was too much work and I couldn't handle it all myself, and I was getting quite frantic. How do I service all these client needs on my own? So I just then took the step in 1989, I think it was, to become Adamson Associates, which meant, getting a proper infrastructure, proper premises, taking on staff, obviously, all sorts of layers, having finance people, office managers, and young consultants. For me, it was quite a step. And realizing that when it came to getting money into the company, the last person to be paid was you, Paul Adamson. You had to pay all the other bills first.
And basically, so you did this really without a clear vision going in and without a business plan? Did it would you describe this as an organic experience where it just kind of happened? Or did you get some advice, and did you have a kind of clear strategy?
No, I sense my answers are disappointing you, Phil. But no, it was basically organic, I suppose. I was on my own as well. People have come after me, and I'm occasionally slightly jealous, were working maybe as duos, as teams, and they were very successful. If you go back the history of successful consultancies, they tend to be two people, maybe three, coming together, working together, maybe financed by an outside person, partially in the first instance. I was on my own, and it was organic, yeah, but I think I didn't feel particularly phased. I was young, of course. This old cliche, when you're young, you don't know what the risks are. I was really, really, really enjoying it. And I realized, going back to both my professional, as we call them, academic skills, such as they were, and whatever my DNA contained, I was in the kind of, for me, the perfect job.
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting, and I think there's a lot of merit, because especially with the whole entrepreneurial conversation today, I think people might over-engineer, what you need to do. Whereas I think when you do it organically, you go and get clients and you deliver a service and you give them more of what they want. And I think that's I think that's the heart of what a business is about. And it doesn't have to be about a kind of 5-10 year vision with very complicated, business plans and documents, which tend to be in business today.
I think you're right. I mean, it was a bit special in those days. I don't want to overstate how things were different then, but the two things spring to mind. One was that people didn't really understand what EU affairs consultancy was, so you had to explain what you were offering. Now it seems such a ridiculous thing to say, but in those days, so you follow EU affairs, and what do you do there? What do your services entail? that level of knowledge, because obviously your clients were often outside Brussels, obviously outside the bubble, and so you have to explain to them, oh, this thing called the EU is quite important, and we have the single act, and we have the single market program of Jacques Delors, and things are happening. And then linked to that, so having explained to people, educated them to a certain extent what the EU is about and how brilliant consultants like myself could help them make their lives easier, there was very little competition, if any, at the beginning. So once you managed to convince somebody that what you're doing was quite useful, there wasn't like there was a long queue of other people they could take their pick from.
Yeah. Now, obviously, with your journey and your perspective, you've seen how the EU has changed, how lobbying has changed. So what is your perspective today about how different things are in terms of lobbying and what it is that the institutions are now trying to do, and what how your industry has changed?
Well, I think we all know by now, it is incredibly now crowded marketplace, right? It's a crowded marketplace for ideas, for services, and all the rest of it. And I think a lot of practitioners, I'm sort of semi-retired, or I still like to dabble in offering advice when people ask me. I think current practitioners fail to appreciate. They think that their particular interest, their particular cause is the only game in town. I'm slightly oversimplifying when I say that. I think if people on the outside only knew, or had a better feeling rather, of what people on the inside get in terms of requests for information, requests for meetings, requests for eye time, as they say, or ear time, they'd be quite taken aback, because people, all sorts of people, even less important policymakers in the food chain, receive hundreds of requests, and that is the key challenge now. Some things don't change. I mean, I try to stop myself sounding like the old boring guy who's seen it all before, but the current, as you know, the current game in town is the Draghi report, the competitiveness agenda, and how to promote that. But 40 years ago, we had the single market program I referenced briefly earlier of Jacques Delors, which entailed 300 proposals coming out within 2 years. This is now slightly the other way around. We're trying to maybe take proposals off the table rather than put them on the table. But and then in between the single market project and now the Draghi competitiveness agenda, there has been, of course, the Koch report, and the idea of making the European economy the most competitive by, what was the year, 2004? I can't remember now. But so plus ça change, all that to say.
Yeah. Now, the way the conversation is conducted, I think when you started, I guess the press corps was extremely small. It's grown massively. You have all these different players, the Politicos, your actives, all the different sources. Now, at the same time, it seems like as the press corps has grown, the importance of journalism has been transformed. And you yourself, as you said, you're still quite involved in different conversations. You have your own podcast. You've been involved in your own media. So I was wondering, how do you describe the change of journalism in the EU and your own role in this? Do you consider yourself a part of the media, or are you slightly outside? How do you see this?
Well, I think it, as a kind of a little health warning at the beginning, when we talk about the media in broad terms, we tend to think automatically of the English language, Anglophone media, right? And if I was maybe a journalist writing in a different language, I might be rather annoyed that all the focus is on the English language media. But that is the reality. But again, going back to all those years when I write in town, it wasn't that. There was kind of European non-Anglophone media which dominated, and there were lots of newsletters in different languages, only one of which was in English, of course, when the UK and Ireland joined the then EEC in 1973. Things have changed enormously. There are more players. It is another truism, but again, a true truism, that things changed dramatically with the arrival of Politico in town 10 years ago, who shook things up dramatically. To answer your question about me directly, I do not consider myself to be a media guy. I don't have a press card. I don't go to press conferences. I don't use that kind of access or whatever. If people want to talk to me, it's because they want to talk to me. I admit it's a slightly strange position to be in, but I was very keen not to try to be seen as exploiting or masquerading as a journalist in what I do. Although I have an online magazine called Encompass, which you referenced, thank you, which is a kind of successor to a glossy magazine called eSharp that I founded 20 odd years ago now. But I've always been clear in my head I should not pretend or claim to be a journalist. I have no formal journalistic training. I don't know, I say I'm not in any professional journalistic body. But things have changed. But things have changed in some ways, like Politico and new players. We can talk about the new players in a second if you have time. But some of the more traditional, what they call legacy media players, haven't changed that much in terms of their presence. I think the Financial Times, to be fair, has a bigger office now, a slightly bigger office, but they've always had 3 or 4 people, even back in the day. And a lot of national newspapers, I'm obviously thinking about more the UK side, but also the American stuff, the Wall Street Journal and those people, they are still relatively modest physical presences in Brussels. That hasn't changed that much, even now.
Right. But I think, when you look at journalism, obviously people are discussing what is journalism today and what drives the conversation. You're lucky with the sun, I guess. I can see that.
Yeah, I may have to move myself slightly to one side, if you don't mind. There you go.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
I'll have to move it again in 2 seconds because the sun is around.
No problem. It's not a usual problem we have in Brussels, too much sun. So what we're discussing, and we look at influence every year and see what are the main drivers of the online influence conversation in Brussels. And we look at social media as playing a huge role. But a lot of the people who are the top influencers there are actually journalists. So you have a kind of overlap between influencer and journalist. You have journalists becoming influencers, becoming podcasters. You are yourself a podcaster. So you have, I would say you certainly, if not a media, certainly what people refer to as influence. So maybe tell us, what is it that you're trying to achieve with your podcast and with your media activities?
Okay. For Encompass, I just wanted to keep a presence. It is something which I call a magazine. It is not news. It's not a newsletter. We don't put out alerts every 5 minutes about some breaking news. I'm trying to use it as a platform for people who want to reach wider audiences. Often, roughly half of the content is I commission, which sounds like a very grand word, but I approach people saying, would you like to write an article about this or that? And normally they say yes. But often people just come to me because they have an idea and they're normally pretty well established in their own right, but they want to reach a wider audience. And I quite like that idea that the world's out there, we can maybe touch on it later on, Phil, is full of good people in a particular profession, but they're also good communicators and deserve, I would argue, to be helped in reaching wider audiences. That's what we need now, especially at the moment, people to understand each other more, obviously. So that's what I do. And then there are elements of the website of Encompass, which remind people, maybe those long memories of the glossy magazine. So the cartoons are very present. It's a very important part of what I do to try and make Europe more accessible, more understandable, make sure we retain, despite all that's going on in the world, a sense of humor. So I'm very keen to maintain that in Encompass. For the podcast, I started the podcast just over 10 years ago. And I thought at the time, although I was wrong, that I was a bit late to the party. And if I'm really, really honest, in prep for this chat this morning, I quickly looked at the first podcast I recorded, 10 years ago, 9 years as well. It was in the run-up to the ill-fated Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, and I was trying to have a number of conversations with experts about what the Brexit referendum was all about, and the possibility of the UK's departure from the EU. I think there's an embarrassingly large number of podcasts in the first few months of the podcast's existence devoted to those broad themes. Obviously, I failed miserably in trying to affect the outcome of the referendum, but I felt very strongly that people didn't know enough about what the stakes were. So that was one motivation, but it wasn't the only motivation. I was very clear also that, as you know, there are basically two kinds of podcasts. There's, apart from the kind of ones that tell a story, investigative podcasts. One is where you have a couple of guys, normally guys, sometimes women. I think women should do more podcasts, frankly. They seem to kind of not be so present. I think there should be more podcasts with women, run by women, two guys chatting about something, and then fine, which is good. But mine was deliberately another style, which is me with a guest each time. So the variety, people may get tired of my voice and hearing my voice, but at least there'd be a different guest each time. Sometimes an author who is keen to talk about a book, but often people just want to talk about their activities. And now it's grown quite extraordinarily. I've seen, of course, now everybody has a podcast, it seems to me. There are very few barriers to entry. But I get over 20,000 downloads a month. People seem to be very appreciative of what I do. People I don't know come up to me and say, I love your podcast. It's very strange. When you're a consultant, you know exactly how effective you are, if you are effective, right? Because if the client tells you so and pays your fees, with a podcast, it's just out there, and all these thousands of people listening, you don't obviously know most of them. So it's very strange, but also very gratifying when people come up to you and say, I love the podcast. And I'm not sure there's any secret sauce about what makes a successful podcast, but I've learned over time, for me, what suits me, what makes a good podcast.
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about the U.S. election, there is a kind of Joe Rogan moment where people say that because Donald Trump really embraced the podcast, especially male podcasters like Joe Rogan, that might have helped to score, some significant strategic advantage. And from this, you could even argue that, podcasters and again, the social media influencers have started to have more impact than traditional media. How would you say this is the case or not in Brussels? Do you think that it's still very much dominated by the Politicos and Euractives of this world? Or do you think, more intimate, more informal conversations are starting to break through? So how do you see that balance?
Okay, let me start, if I may, Phil, with a little anecdote. Back in the days before Politico even had a podcast, the guy who wrote the Daily Playbook was a very well-known personality called Ryan Heath. And he told me he'd been trying for quite some time without success to get his bosses to agree for him to do a podcast. And he was very frustrated. I think that's a public record. That wasn't happening. And so I was doing these podcasts already, of course, and I did one with Martin Selmayr when he was Juncker's chief of staff. And everyone was talking about, the then political commission, the restructuring of commission. That seems obvious, but it's not such a long time ago. We had these clusters of commissioners, which was a bit of a novelty, a bit of an innovation. And so Martin very kindly agreed to talk to me. We had a friendly chat about, very much internal, you can find it on the website, about the restructuring of the commission. A bit nerdy, but I find that stuff quite interesting. And I sent it to Ryan, and the next day in the newsletter, he not only listened to the podcast, which is nice, he took whole extracts from it and put it on as the main story. And I said, thank you very much, Ryan. Why? Well, I'm using it as ammunition for my bosses, to convince my bosses to give me one. And I was told that by many people. I happened to be that evening at a reception farewell for Peter Spiegel, then the FT bureau chief, and everybody was talking about that, not because of me, but because people in the commission, and especially, were hearing for the first time via that podcast what Martin Selmayr's motivation and strategy was in restructuring the commission. To answer your question, finally, it doesn't quite apply, right? The Joe Rogan style in Brussels, because we're not like having a leader in Europe, although maybe some people would argue that, including Politico, that Donald Trump is Europe's leader. That's a joke, obviously. But I think that what the good thing about podcasts, so two things maybe. One is the length. They shouldn't be too long, of course, but you can learn an awful lot by just, we're so used to these quick snap, not so much so on legacy, on terrestrial media, I'm talking about broadcast media, where people talk for a couple of minutes or 30 seconds or 45 seconds. So this is a kind of more relaxed conversation. And it's lengthier and people relax. And if it's done, I'm obviously especially pleading here, if it's not done by a journalist who's not looking out for a kind of gotcha question, which maybe make a headline, the next day, then I think that your guest relaxes and enjoys the conversation as well. So that's the kind of atmosphere I try to achieve. And some of the best podcasts out there, which are much more successful than mine, strike that balance, in my view.
Yeah, I think what's interesting also about what you just said is that, there's a lot of talk about how people's attention span has collapsed because of social media. So, because of TikTok, you have a 30-second attention span, when in fact, people are also willing to spend 2 or 3 hours listening to these incredibly long podcasts. So I think this idea of attention span is a complete misunderstanding of how we function. People just want different ways to consume information.
Yeah.
And I think that podcasts and new media has basically given people a different way to inform themselves, where the traditional media structure is no longer as powerful. And I think the example you gave is very interesting, because Ryan Heath, by the way, was one of the leading EU influencers in our early, I think in the first ranking, he was actually twice in a row the top influencer. So he had his presence on Twitter. That was what they called it then. And that was where he was having a huge impact. And then you mentioned a conversation with Martin Saltmeier. And I think we've actually done some work with Martin Saltmeier during the Juncker election. And so this is also where Brussels obviously is very different from the US landscape I just described, where what matters is conversations with a few people. And if you impact one person and you change their mind, that can be enough to actually have an impact. And as I just want to check with your podcast, have you had any kind of moments when you felt that, in addition to the one you just mentioned, where you had a real impact on a conversation on a topic? I know you couldn't save us from Brexit, but was there anything where you felt I at least had an impact and influenced somebody's perspective?
Yeah, it's not my primary motivation to have an impact. It's just to have a civilized conversation with somebody who's interesting. I think if I'm thinking about different podcasts, had different aspects. I just done one with the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Alexandra Matvichuk, and I think maybe it was part of my subconscious was trying to get her to talk about Europe's role in helping to defend Ukraine. I wasn't trying to talk to her too much detail, that given her job position, it was just to maybe sensitize people in Europe that what we have to do, and not just political elites, but obviously the public at large. Another recent example, I did a chat with Catherine Day, the former Secretary General of the European Commission, because I know her very well since a very long time. We're on the board of a think tank together in London, and as you know, she's been made a chair of a high-level committee on the restructuring or the reform of the European Commission civil service, not the Commission as a structure, but the civil service, not the college, but the civil service. And that was picked up by Euractiv, and I think some of the staff unions were up in arms. I'm not sure how many people representing the Commission's workers in the staff union office have actually listened to the podcast, because Catherine was quite measured, very measured in her remarks, as you would expect from Catherine. But it was slightly she was misrepresented maybe by people who hadn't actually listened to the actual podcast. But it's nice to be noticed, obviously, and it's nice to people. It's a way to get people to listen, obviously, to a podcast. But I'm not trying to use it as a vehicle I have no particular agenda, and I try very hard to have a balance on the topic. Maybe I'm sure I don't succeed totally, but that's the idea. By the way, the name Encompass for my website is not an accident either. I put a dictionary definition of encompass on the homepage, which is to represent all shades of opinion within reason. Maybe not really extreme views, but I try pretty hard to be balanced. People know I'm a Brit, although I also have a French passport. People know I'm very pro-European. That's hardly a secret. But beyond that, I try to be as balanced as possible.
Yeah, well, trying to encompass all opinions in today's environment can be a bit of a challenge, because obviously the big question is, how far do you go on the right or on the left? And I want to come to the polarization of politics, because basically, what we're seeing around us is a fragmentation of the political conversation. Some people say social media played a part in making this worse. So what is your view on the current kind of political climate? Are you generally worried and pessimistic that things are getting worse and worse, or are you still kind of at heart an optimist, thinking that it's just a bad moment and it'll get better? What are your feeling, and how do you think the EU is doing in this climate?
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it, to measure this kind of stuff, as it's quite subtle, and who knows what's going on inside people's brains when they read something. I think also it's not just misinformation. I would argue up to a point. I'm not sure how much this stands up as a thesis, but bear with me. It's misinformation is all around, and disinformation, and we're getting better maybe at spotting it. And it's up to, obviously it's up to authorities, people in power to be more aware of that and devote more resources to tackling that. It's also up, frankly, to individuals, citizens, to be more savvy about and being able to spot misinformation. Especially AI doesn't help, obviously. But then there's also another thing, which is my little thesis, is there's a kind of, it's not even misinformation, I'm not sure there's a word for it, when people are quick to jump to a conclusion. The anecdote just now about the Commission staff unions is a good example. If they listened to the podcast, they would have heard some very sensible ideas coming out of Catherine Day's mouth about, maybe we should have different kinds of people working for the Commission, not just lawyers and economists, scientists and engineers. But I think that didn't stop them issuing, listening to the podcast didn't take place, I suspect, because they then issued lots of statements saying this is outrageous. And she's trying to rip up the rule book for human resources. Not at all. I think it's just, my point being, in a very meandering, long-winded way, Phil, is that people could be under so much pressure, all of us, to know everything about everything all the time. And we often just read headlines or the first sentence or opening paragraph of a piece or something, and then jump to a conclusion. Another example I'll give you of that, and it's a bit esoteric, but again, bear with me. Everybody's now talking, going back to the Draghi report, how this very impressive new think tank called EPIC, run by a very impressive guy called Antonios Nestoras, talk about only in the first year of the Draghi report being presented to the authorities, to Ursula von der Leyen, September of last year, only 11% of recommendations have been implemented. So two things on that. I asked Antonios to write me an article for Encompass because I was genuinely intrigued. Could you just explain the methodology, how you arrived at 11%? It wasn't inherently critical. It was just pointing out, from his point of view, the extent to which or not the recommendations had been fulfilled or been followed. And he used a pretty detailed methodology, which you can read by looking at the article on the Encompass website, which I recommend. But secondly, there's a very vulnerable, now retired, senior European Commission official called Ricardo Perisic, who ran basically the Delors program as Director General of something called DG3 back in the mid-80s when Jacques Delors was president. And he came, in his article, he says that in June 85, all member states, heads of government around the table endorsed single market program unanimously. And he said then 18 months later, in December 86, the number of proposals approved by the council, 0. And he was simply pointing out, not so much that the member states were failing to do their job, maybe that was slightly implicit in his statement, but more importantly, that things take time to be implemented. And some people rush into judgment that the Draghi report is being abandoned, is not being prosecuted successfully. Should maybe just stand back and reflect, well, things are happening, maybe not quite as quickly as you might like, but just take stock and reflect a bit more. That's what I'm trying to say. There's this misinformation, disinformation, but there's also this kind of information, you want to call it information, where people just jump to conclusions prematurely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think this is I would say, people don't take the time, a lot of time, to read beyond the headline or beyond the little bubble, the 30-second video that you have on social media, which is what some people call the underlying source of the problem, because it creates clickbait. So you have a title and you jump for it, and it's designed to be provocative because it creates more engagement, more anger. And some people argue that this is the strategy of the Trump administration, which is you grab the attention, you grab the conversation by saying something that's pretty outrageous. Now, this is there's something beyond that, and I want to go back to my question about where are we with the EU here, because we hear the Trump administration being incredibly critical about Europe, the European project. And we see inside certain countries, the far right, questioning the institutions. So do you think that the EU project is kind of under some kind of existential threat? And how do you feel as a kind of pro-European about that? And what should people who believe in the project do?
Yeah. One phrase which I particularly dislike, I mean, it's trotted out quite frequently, maybe too frequently, is that progress in Europe is always forward through a crisis. We need a crisis in order to make significant change. It might be true, but it's as if we don't need a crisis maybe to reflect. En passant, Catherine Day in my podcast says with this report she's steering is not been commissioned in time of crisis, and so that people have more time to relax and to reflect on what they're doing. But it is true. I mean, you use the word existential, which is maybe used a bit too much sometimes, but people are saying, right, as we're recording this, Phil, at the end of the week, there's a European Council where the Mercosur deal and funding for Ukraine are on the table, hugely controversial, not much unity visible for the moment. Maybe as we speak, maybe the information is already out of date. There'll be some early morning deals struck. But I think I've been around for so long where people have said this time it's different, this time it's existential. So I'm hesitating about using such language. But it does seem to me that all my many decades of experience and of being around in the bubble, that this time it's serious, and we have to rethink how we go about things. It's not a question at all of dismantling or throwing away Europe, because it is that is the European Union is an ideal, and also the European project, but different forms of a cooperation. And as a Brit saying this, it always sounds a bit suspicious, but other kinds of cooperation, which involves countries which are not formally members of the European Union, I think that's also a way to go in the future. It's already happening, obviously, especially in the defense and security field, and that model maybe can be developed going forward.
Yeah, and there's also a kind of very pro-European narrative that's emerging, or maybe it's wishful thinking, but there was a piece in Politico about young pro-Europeans being kind of radically pro-European, which is actually something that we haven't really seen in a lot of the political conversation. You tend to have centrists saying, Europe's a good thing and we're pragmatic, and then you have the populists saying, these are terrible things. But what you don't really see a lot of is people saying we completely, we are very enthusiastic about the vision of Europe, the ideal of Europe, the kind of way beyond things. So, and this is something I saw during the EU influencer event. We had some young Europeans who were the Instagrammers who were talking about Europe in a way that said that was very positive. And I think basically this shows that there is that. So do you see some of that excitement about Europe still there? Because I think there's a generational element to that. So
I think it has to be, unfortunately, set against also other surveys, other studies, which polling, which indicates that young people, first of all, these kind of sound a bit dismissive, and given my age, I want to avoid sounding dismissive to the younger generation, but take democracy for granted. Haven't fought in world wars. Most of us haven't fought in major wars either. It's not just young people. And they seem, according to some polling, right, they seem what's wrong with living in an autocracy as opposed to democracy type stuff. But you're absolutely right, what you just said, and I agree with that. And we have to build on that. I mean, it's partially, I think, because also it's the European ideal, which is still fresh. When I arrived in Brussels, I was the same age as these people now, expressing their enthusiasm for the European project, which is I'm not too happy with that phrase, but it's okay. Everybody uses it, so I'll use it. But I think it's also dissatisfaction with national politics as well. People seeing that national governments and local governments, regional governments back home are not delivering the way they want, so they're looking maybe to something else. Somewhere else to help provide some of the solutions, and good luck to Europeans for doing that. It does beg the question, to be very blunt, that how the institutions are run. It's a lot of people say having Ursula von der Leyen as a very influential president is something to be welcome, because things get done, but then obviously at the price of maybe being seen as rather autocratic internally, certainly. So that I think there's a balance to be struck, and I think that's something that the Commission has to be mindful of going forward. There's still, 4 years of this Commission to run, and maybe some of the management style has to be revisited, and some of the other, I'm slightly building on your questions, should we say, Phil, but the other commissioners should be more visible, because they're all, at the end of the day, they have their own portfolios. But going back to your point about the European project and young people, they are also great ambassadors beyond their portfolios, which can be often quite confusing because they overlap with other commissioners' portfolios. But if I was in charge, I'd make sure that all commissioners were giving, talks and engaging with young generation people all over the shop, because that should be part of their job as well as their own individual portfolios.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing, more and better communication coming out of the Commission. It's still very much an organic, I would say, attempt rather than a kind of strategic one. Now, when you meet these young people, and I'm sure people come to you for advice, recent graduates or even people who are deciding what to study, in this very confusing environment with new technology, new trends, AI, other things coming online, what is your advice to them? What do you think they should be studying? What's the mindset that you recommend, or what are the tips you give them?
I think that it is, as we said earlier, it's a very crowded place there, right? People jostling for access, for attention. And if this is me trying to give advice slightly presumptuously to a younger generation, 2 or 3 things spring to mind. One is be mindful of that you have to sort of give back as well. There's a temptation, because people are under such pressure to deliver, and you have these ridiculous key performance indicators, KPIs to comply with. But just be, whatever you're doing, if you're already lucky enough to have a job, which is an achievement in itself in the current economic circumstances, but also looking for a job, have the mindset that I'm I'm doing my job as best as I can, but I want to also be seen as someone who gives back, who offers help to other people. So it's more of a two-way process, and that should be a natural reflex. If it's not a natural reflex, people should work on it so it becomes more natural, and I guarantee it will stand you in good stead in the future. That is something very important. Something else I would suggest also is that there's a great temptation, and it's difficult to be too critical, to all speak the same jargon in the bubble, right? Because it's, and I'm speaking also specifically of non-Anglophones who have to spend most of their time, I suspect, speaking English, normally maybe French, but not their own mother tongue. And after all these years, I'm still hugely admiring of people who do that without any kind of hesitation. It's extraordinary, and to listen to conversation in the coffee shops or eavesdropping 2 or 3 people speaking, using English for the conversation, even though none of them are native English speakers. But so we speak the same jargon, but and it's a way, if 2 or 3 people say, for example, did you see what happened in the AFET committee in the Parliament? Well, if you have to think twice about those who know by definition. AFET committee, as you know, is the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is based on the French wording, Affaires étrangères. But it's not so obvious to people beyond the bubble, as it were. But then we use those kind of shortcuts and those acronyms, and it's perfectly fine and understandable. But then it's almost like you have to unlearn it. So when you go back and talk to other people, don't talk about the AFET committee. Remind yourself to talk about the European Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. And then thirdly, going back to my point about native English speakers should always be respectful of the fact and sensitive to the fact that they are more often not have the great privilege of speaking their own language, which doesn't mean they should not make an effort to speak other languages when they have the opportunity. And it's a gesture. It's for me, it's correct to do that kind of thing. It'll give you more empathy towards people who have to speak English as a foreign language, when you feel you can't quite find the right word, it'll grow your empathy for the challenges that other people have. You may not realize, because most of your non-Anglophone friends speak English so well. So those things I would suggest to young people starting out.
Excellent. And now, do you have a book recommendation or a podcast for our listeners and viewers?
I've been, because another cliche, the continent of Europe is in turmoil, right? And we thought wars were a thing of the past, and if they were going to be a thing of the past, if they were not to be a thing of the past, they'd be very much driven by technology. But since we have this current situation, especially with Ukraine, I've been thinking a lot about the First World War of the last century. And there's a terrific book by the eminent, now deceased American historian Barbara Tuchman called The Guns of August, which explains how Europe sort of, blindly went into the First World War. Quite extraordinary. We think about Queen Victoria's 3 grandchildren, George the Fifth, the Kaiser, and the Tsar of Russia were all her grandchildren. Quite extraordinary. And linked to that, a novel set in the First World War called Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, which I strongly recommend. And maybe to finish off the trilogy, maybe not a podcast, but also a film, the more recent film, 1917, directed by Sam Mendes, which was extraordinarily powerful, also filmed in basically one shot for whatever, an hour and a half, an hour, 2 hours. It was quite an extraordinary achievement, amazing film. On podcast, I can only suggest something which is 20 million other people would also agree with, which is the number of downloads it gets every month, which is The Rest is History. Those 2 eminent historians, and they are so brilliant and so witty and so erudite that I think they deserve their 20 million monthly followers.
Very good recommendation. I'm also a big fan. I will recommend, actually, I'm reading Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, which is actually the book that was the source of the play or the musical, which obviously dives into the American history. And what I feel it reminds us is that there was a lot of conflict, a lot of polarization, a lot of very big questions about where the US was going to, what it was going to become. And I think because we've been in this stable area for 50 plus, for 80 years almost, I think we forget that there are moments of constructions or reconstructions or discussions. So it's always worth, and I think The Rest is History is also a good way to go, a good place to go to look back at things with a better perspective. But that's all we have time. So thank you so much for your insights and sharing your stories. Looking forward to continuing this conversation online, to checking your podcast as well as Encompass. Thank you so much, and see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Phil.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the ZNL podcast. Did you like it? If so, please share it on your social media, subscribe, and give us a comment. We will see you again on the next episode. Until then, remember, stay always one step ahead.